Andreas, for the warm welcome, and Peter and all the translators, interpreters, and everyone who is here today. Wherever you are, it's very exciting for me to be here. I'm very excited about talking about mental health among refugees. As a twice immigrant, I was never a refugee. I had my own personal challenges in both, United States and Canada when I was an immigrant. And so this is a very kind of personal project for me as well. And I also had a chance to see some of the Syrian refugee camps in southeastern Turkey, where actually my sister, Serife Tekin, she's an infectious disease professor, and for 5 or 6 years she was working at a university hospital on the border. So I had a chance to learn a lot from her and her experience on those refugee camps. So without further ado, I would like to start my presentation. So I just want to kind of draw attention to this picture to kind of remind us. I feel like, at least in the United States, COVID took over all kinds of conversations about refugees and refugee mental health. But it's important to kind of remind just this cartoon just from a few years ago, when the Syrian refugee crisis, when it was on its peak, and unfortunately a lot of countries had turned a blind eye to what was happening to those refugees. And I really like this cartoon for that reason.
Serife, sorry to interrupt you. We can't see your slides yet. You still have to put them up.
Oh, sure, sorry. I skipped the most important part. Oh, here we go.
Thanks.
Let's see. Okay, here we go. So this is actually the picture. So you can probably view it closely after the recording. That's the world's response to Syrian refugees because of the fear of them sinking the world, as if that might be possible. Okay, so the kind of starter here is, these are again pre-COVID numbers. COVID-19 appears to increase the load of mental health burdens on everyone experiencing it for a variety of reasons. But prior to COVID-19, according to the World Health Organization report, 50% of people with mental disorders in high-income countries receive no treatment. So there's a major treatment gap in mental health care. There's an uneven supply and demand. There's high demand and low supply. The situation is even worse in low and middle income countries, where 85% of people with mental disorders receive no treatment. So among the reasons that mental health treatment demand is high and supply is low is, lack of available services. People simply do not have access to mental health resources to address their needs. There's also inability to recognize symptoms, to kind of reflect on some kind of mental distress might be happening to you and that you might maybe need help. Another important reason is cost. Of course, even in countries like United States, high-income countries, unfortunately, healthcare system requires a lot of reformation, and people do experience or do avoid mental health care for a variety of cost reasons. And last but not least, stigma around mental disorders prevents people from seeking help. Of course, this situation puts an even more burden to vulnerable populations such as refugees. So this is a picture of a mental health clinic in a refugee camp in Lebanon. And as you can see, it's less than ideal looking. So these developments, in conjunction with an increased enthusiasm about the artificial intelligence and its application to health domains, there was this kind of, oh, well, maybe we can use artificial intelligence to help us meet these increasing demands for mental health. Maybe AI psychotherapy chatbots, which I will be speaking about in a minute, maybe they can fill this gap. So to address this kind of to enable individuals to download an app and simply kind of receive help that way to address their mental health became a kind of an exciting, enthusiastic idea that a lot of developers in the Silicon Valley in the United States jumped on. So there are a number of apps. MyCompass and Robot are two of them. And I will be talking about that. So here is what I aim to do in this talk. I will first talk about the technology, the technical side of what I call artificially intelligent psychotherapy chatbots, just to give you an idea about how they work. This will be in broad strokes, but I'm happy to answer questions more in the question session. And then I will talk about how some of these psychotherapy chatbots were attempted to be used in refugee mental health care contexts. And then I will connect this very nature of and assumptions underlying the creation of these psychotherapy chatbots to Joseph Heinrich's recent work on the concept of weird people. And we'll say a few words about that. And then I will end with some ethical concerns about wanting to treat individuals in refugee camps who are struggling with mental health issues with these psychotherapy chatbots. So let's get started. So AI psychotherapy chatbots are grounded theoretically on two phenomena. So the theory bit comes from cognitive behavior therapy, a method of psychotherapeutic treatment developed by Aaron Beck in 1970s. The other technical line, so this is the kind of assumptions about how mental illness might be treated, and to execute this in the kind of context of a chatbot in an app, the technology that is being used is digital phenotyping. And I will talk about these both briefly. So let's first look at the cognitive behavior therapy. So the idea of cognitive behavior therapy, the main assumption is that our thoughts, feelings, and behavior are intimately tied to one another, meaning our thoughts generate our feelings and our feelings generate our behavior, and there's a cycle. There's a maybe vicious, maybe virtuous cycle between how those are connected back to our thoughts. So one of the assumptions is, one of the kind of original ideas that Beck put forward was that individuals feel bad not because of events, but because how they think about those events. So it's not just the events that lead us to kind of have depression, for instance, but how we think about those events. So because there's this tight connection between how our thoughts and feelings and behavior, if we can intervene at one level, meaning if we can change our thoughts, for instance, then we can change our feelings and behavior. So one of the kind of biggest kind of suggestions is when you're responding to a situation is to kind of rethink and reframe how you are thinking. So one example is, let's say you're smoking and you're trying to quit smoking and you did not smoke for 5 days, but then that one day when you were watching the news, you got really upset and you were like, okay, I'm gonna light a cigarette. And then immediately after you have a few puff, you realize, oh, I wanted to quit smoking. So then you might think that I will never be able to quit smoking. A cognitive behavior therapist tells you, no, that's all or nothing thinking. Instead, how about you reframe this and say, I have not quit smoking yet. This means this introduces that distance between that thought and feeling of disappointment with yourself and kind of allows you develop more responses and to cope better. So that's the idea. So in an ideal setting, cognitive behavior therapy is done by a therapist, by a skilled therapist, and they help a patient to kind of practice, right? So a skillful therapist will catch you in your automatic thoughts and say, no, just reframe that and let's go back to the beginning. So that's how it's supposed to work. And it's an evidence-based psychotherapy. It's actually one of the most cited effective methods of psychotherapeutic treatments out there. So now this AI psychotherapy chatbots combine that theoretical framework with this phenomenon of digital phenotyping. So Phenotypes are observable traits and behavior that are generated in an interaction between our biology, our genes, and the environment, including the social environment, right? So this digital phenotyping basically refers to inferring, understanding an individual's behavior by looking into their use of cell phones and other wearable technologies, right? You might have a Strava app that tracks your run. So that's kind of one way in which to infer that you were running this morning, because we can look at your data on Strava. So this idea of digital phenotyping is very, very attractive, because now there's an increased, digital technology that, we have smartphones, we have wearable technologies, and so on and so forth. So we can actually, without revealing it ourselves, we can be identified where we were through the GPS location technology, where we were. Well, I was in Texas, and Andreas is in Europe somewhere, right? And voice patterns, there's a way in which it tracks, our voices are tracked through our cell phones. Our speech, are we speaking fast or slow? How long our texts are? How many times we go check social media, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. These are all can be tracked. And the idea is we can observe and infer people's behavior by looking at their footprints in these digital technologies. So there are two different kinds of data to track this. So some of it is called passive data. So this is when now there's a way to track me on my maybe like smartwatch that I'm located in Texas, in San Antonio. So that's passive. I don't have to enter any information. It's just that, in my Google settings or in my phone settings, it's identified where I am. So it doesn't require an active user participation. Another form of data is the active data that we actually insert ourselves. I might, check in on Facebook at which restaurant I'm in, or, I might be using a chatbot or an app or a game where I'm actively engaged. So active data. So these psychotherapy chatbot technology primarily uses active data. But let's kind of, look at this optimism and enthusiasm about digital phenotyping as a technology, as a way to track mental health. So this gentleman is Thomas Insel. He was the former director of the National Institutes of Mental Health in the United States. And this institution is the largest funding agency in the United States and probably around the world that funds mental health research. So he was the director of that institution, and then he left and started working for Google Health, because he got really enthusiastic and excited about the power of digital phenotyping to be able to track mental health status and enable early, timely interventions. So how does that work? So for instance, he says, let's take depression. If somebody is getting depressed, they might be talking to fewer people than normal. They might be speaking slower or say less or use a smaller vocabulary. They might return fewer calls or text messages. They might spend more time at home and go to fewer places. I guess this was before COVID again. I didn't anticipate that we would all be sitting in our homes and not going anywhere. And we might be able to track like people's sleep patterns. And all of these give us the power to even diagnose someone with depression without even the person themselves are realizing. So here's a very significant and I think powerful quote, like just represents how he thinks about this technology. He says, putting sensor data, speech, voice data, and human-computer interaction together might provide a digital phenotype that could do for psychiatry what HbA1c or serum cholesterol has done for other areas of medicine. So this is a very, very strong claim, giving precision to diagnosis and accuracy to outcomes. And I think it's significant, and he's not alone, right? He's one of the leaders of this field, kind of this optimism, but he's not alone. So, and in that sense, the AI chatbots combine cognitive behavioral therapy assumptions about mental health with digital phenotyping technology. So if you're users of Facebook, you might have already seen it. There's an app connected to Facebook called Vobot, and that's an example of a smart psychotherapy app. So I actually, because I'm a naturalistic philosopher, as Andrea said, I downloaded this app myself and used it for a couple of weeks just to see how it works. And so I took a bunch of screenshots that I'm going to share with you now how it kind of works. So you download this app on your phone. So the assumption is that because it's an artificially intelligent chatbot, it learns from you. So the more you share your feelings, your behavior, and so on and so forth, the better it learns your habits and your thought patterns. And the assumption is that it will be able to help you better when you're not feeling well. So you download it, and it first kind of introduces you how it works. So it says, see the word button down below. This is how you talk to me for now. And then these are interesting. You don't have to type your response. I mean, you can type your response, but there are also automatic boxes that appear there that says, got it. I never say got it, like in my regular conversations with people, but you can actually choose that option and click, and you kind of engage in this conversation with the robot. And then it says, okay, let's get started. I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I like to work with humans. And, again, there's a section that says, I'm all ears. And then you type on it, and then you say that. And then it talks about how it helps people by using cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. If you want to know more about CBT, you have an option to a link. And if you already know about it, you can skip that section. Next, it says, I help using, people with CBT. What is CBT? CBT is a different approach to mental health. It teaches people the skills they need to help themselves. And it's been proven to work by science. And it takes you to a bunch of links on the effectiveness of cognitive behavior therapy. And then, so this is, again, an automatic kind of entry. And I clicked on it because I found it interesting and entertaining. It says no childhood stuff. And then it says, sorry, you'll have to go to a human therapist's office for that. But if you want to talk to me on the couch, go right ahead. So we find that Wobot is very humorous. He has a lot of, it has a lot of sense of humor, jokes with you, and, kind of, it's very light. There's no tweed jackets or pipes or Australian accents. It isn't so much about things that happened in the past. It's about how we think and talk to ourselves. And then, there's this picture of a, pipe smoking robot there. So, and basically this app was developed by Alison Darcy. And again, at Silicon Valley, she was formerly at Stanford University, and she's a psychologist. And she says, listen, I really wanted to help, find a better way to help people receive mental health. And she talks very highly, obviously, about this chatbot. Wobot, she says, it tracks your mood, it gives you insight, it teaches you stuff, it helps you feel better, and it's there 24/7, and it learns from you over time. So more recently, there was a really great Wired magazine article, I think in 2020, last year in June, about how now these robots or these chatbot technologies are even receiving a higher demand because of COVID, because of the pandemic, and people are having more difficulty with their mental health problems. And in fact, so this is an app. So because it's somewhat related to healthcare and health-related issues, it's under the purview of Food and Drug Administration in the United States to kind of oversee this. And they didn't really kind of allow these kinds of apps to be released widely until the pandemic. Starting with the pandemic, the FDA decided, actually, this is a great technology that might get people the help that they need. And they kind of lifted a lot of the protections and oversight. And now there's an increase in the use of these kinds of apps. So as a philosopher, of course, I care about what things are called, right? So this is being framed and marketed as therapy. So one question that I immediately thought of, is this really therapy? So what is therapy? So therapy, the kind of verb comes from Greek. And when you look at the etymology, it means basically to serve, to attend, to be servant, to take care of something or someone. It can be people, animals, mind, etc. And in the 5th century, Hippocrates used this word in the context of medicine, and he referred to it as like to heal and to cure. So therapio is also a transitive verb, which means it's directional. So it seems like giver and the receiver, like to serve, to attend, for instance, is something that someone does to another person. So it assumes 2 agents. So it implies multiple agents or persons participating in the process of healing or taking care. So this assumption, calling these chatbots therapists assumes that chatbots are agents, and that's a problematic assumption. So just to kind of raise that flag, as I move forward, something for us to think about. So now, of course, when these technologies kind of started getting attention and a lot of, support from like large universities and, decent enough private funding, there was this idea of using these chatbots for humanitarian purposes, taking, for instance, refugees in the refugee camps, these apps to help them cope better with their mental health issues. So these pictures are taken by my sister, who is in this picture. She's here. So she visited a lot of Syrian refugee sites in Turkey. She was responsible for their infection control. So she allowed me to use the photographs that she's taken. And, there are lots of kind of physical, of course, environmental related issues pertaining to hygiene, spread of disease, and so on, that she was trying to help and educate the, people there. So, and when you kind of look at the statistics, I had access to basically the number of Syrians who fled to Lebanon. So since the conflict started, more than 1 million Syrians fled to Lebanon. And this is a picture from one of the refugee camps in Lebanon. And about 20% of these refugees have kind of reported experience of some kind of mental disorder, mostly PTSD resembling phenomena after, of course, they lost their loved ones, livelihood, community, and homes, and were forced to leave where they were living. So among the symptoms, among the experiences that they had, come excessive nervousness, continuous crying, self-isolation, and trouble sleeping, and so on. So, of course, it's very hard to meet their mental health demands because a lot of mental health services in Lebanon are private, and they are not available for refugees. Also, it's extremely challenging to find Arabic-speaking therapists who will volunteer in conflict zones. So there's a lot of there are lots of concerns, and people are really strained. I mean, even and I say even because immediately we think about physical health as being the most important thing. A lot of physical health issues like infectious diseases in the camps and so on were really, really hard to control. So there was even more burden on those agencies who were also trying to address mental health problems. So, and this is kind of where AI chatbots fit in. So there was this idea, well, AI counselors need no plane tickets, no food or protection or salaries. They can easily handle caseloads in the tens of thousands, and they can be available at any time, either via text message or anyone with a mobile phone. And the most important part of aspect of this chatbot technology is not to be underestimated. It's hard to find Arab-speaking therapists who will want to go there, go into those conflict zones, but it should not be that hard to create an app in Arabic, right? So that flexibility, that linguistic flexibility really excited people. So, and then this AI company, X2 AI Incorporated, again, in the Silicon Valley, developed this app called Kareem. It's an Arabic name. That was actually used in some of the refugee camps in Lebanon. So the idea, so Kareem, I could not download Kareem. In fact, I could not find a lot of information about the latest iteration of Kareem, unfortunately. But basically, Kareem seems to be working like Wobot does. You know, it gets smarter as it interacts with users. And it was very hard to translate the nature of a chatbot, or the nature of a chatbot and the nature of a therapist to Arabic, because I mean, there's not a similar concept or phenomena in Arabic culture. So it was initially framed as a friend rather than a therapist. And results are anecdotal. I mean, a lot of the results on the effectiveness of chatbot therapy are inconclusive. Like they're in like lower group samples. There's not a lot of, you know, trials and so on. And it's even more low, of course, in an app that is used in primarily refugee population. So the results are anecdotal. In a Guardian article about this, they interviewed one of the individuals who used it, and he was a teacher in one of the refugee camps. He himself was also a refugee. He said basically a lot of his students, people who were interacting with this chatbot, had difficulty kind of understanding that it was, you know, are they interacting with a person or a machine? That was unclear. They didn't understand that they were not interacting with a person, but then they realized they were not interacting with a person. And this person that they interviewed said, well, also realizing that it was not a person kind of relieved some of the people of the, you know, social stigmas associated with having mental health issues. So maybe that was helpful, he says. So now I want to kind of, you know, again, I want to turn to this concept of weird people. And I want to say a few words about the kind of the nature of chatbot therapy, chatbot therapists, this technology, and the variety of assumptions it makes about humans, but also human psychology. So I'm going to say that AI psychotherapy chatbot technology imposes weird standards to understanding and treating mental illness. So as I was finalizing my presentation last night, I realized that even this notion of weird, Heinrich's concept of weird, is very, very hard to translate in other languages. It's a very intrinsically kind of Western diagnosis of a Western problem. So the architect of this idea is Joseph Heinrich. He is a fantastic researcher. I mean, I want to really, like, I admire his work primarily of its interdisciplinary nature and its thorough analysis of how, you know, human social sciences and psychological sciences actually have developed primarily in the West. So WEIRD is an acronym, and it stands for Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. So his main argument, so his initial work on this topic showed that most of the work in human psychology and social sciences are built on experimental subjects composed primarily of undergraduate students in leading research universities in the West. So, you know, think about a science like psychology, right? It's the study of human mind. And a lot of this experimental research on the human mind took place using a very, very limited and very homogeneous social group, like undergraduate students at Western universities. So then this means that the research that is based on this set of normal people, you know, are assumed to be universal traits or universal features of human nature and human brain and human emotional system. So, you know, kind of, you know, connecting it to chatbot therapy, even this very idea of someone feeling comfortable to share their feelings and seek help from others, for instance, is actually a very uniquely Western phenomena. It's not largely and widely shared by other cultures, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So that was his initial research program, and his most recent book, called The Weirdest People in the World, he basically kind of does a historical and anthropological study of how kind of humans or societies in the West evolved to be what they are, or how they evolved to have these like, weird characteristics. So according to his analysis, again, what is usually thought of as universal human features turn out to be the features of people primarily in these who live in these weird countries, in Western developed educated countries. And there are a variety of characteristics. And the most important ones that I'm going to highlight here is that there is an assumption that humans are individualistic. They are self-obsessed. They're, obsessed with self-improvement, self-development, thinking about themselves and their vision. They are control-oriented. They are non-conformist and analytical. So, but turns out these features are not universal, but rather peculiar to weird countries. So Daniel Dennett did an excellent review of this book, and I'm going to quote him because he says it a lot better than I could say. He says, turns out billions of inhabitants who have minds strikingly different from ours. And we weirdos, he continues, are individualistic, think analytically, believe in free will, take personal responsibility, feel guilt when we misbehave, and think nepotism is to be vigorously discouraged, and so on and so forth, right? So one problem that I find in the kind of AI psychotherapy chatbot technology is that it's applies very weird-like standards to understanding mental health and treatment, especially when it's being promoted to be an effective tool to help people in refugee camps deal with their mental health issues. So, and that raises a very important question. Should we be imposing these criteria on human psychology and human mental health in Middle Eastern communities? So, and this research in general about kind of weird cultures and, the assumptions of uniformity of human characteristics around the world has very important implications for how we ought to understand mental disorders at large. So one of my, favorite philosophers, Natalia Washington, did great work on kind of applying some of these questions into the way we study and understand mental disorders. So she says, cross-cultural diversity picture of the human mind implies a variation in mental illnesses, and this kind of variation in human psychology should inform the way we do psychiatry and we think about mental health. So I encourage you to look at her work for kind of these, larger, bigger issues about the implications of weird research to psychiatry at large. But I'm going to apply it here specifically on AI chatbots. So I'm going to kind of go over what I consider to be weird assumptions of psychotherapy chatbot technology. Some of this list will resemble Heinrich's original list, right? So he says one of the assumptions that we make about human psychology is that, is self-obsession, but turns out it's not a universal feature. So this very idea of there is a world crisis of like refugee crisis, and I lost my home and, immigrated or, found refuge in a different country. I'm living in a tent. And this kind of idea of downloading an app on your phone to deal with your mental health problems feels very kind of assuming this self-obsession, like, oh, I should fixate on myself to develop a better response to my experience as a refugee. And that seems a little tone deaf to me because it strikes me as medicalization of or individualization of social and political problems. So one of the other assumptions that is made about and being taught as a universal feature is being control oriented. And again, this very idea of kind of taking charge of your thoughts and feelings with the help of an app assumes some kind of like this obsession with control, which may not be a shared feature. I mean, a Syrian refugee might be Muslim, and they might, kind of, rather than trying to control the situation, allow the situation to be taken care of by Allah, right? Like, I mean, it's very important to consider, I think, those, background cultural and religious beliefs in thinking about whether an app like this would be actually helpful to an individual, a Syrian refugee. Again, another feature is being analytical, thinking and reasoning better. So that person that the Guardian interviewed about his use of Kareem, that the chatbot, said there were these kind of, when he was using the app, there was these like moments where he would share his frustrations or his feelings and so on. And the app would say, focus on now and focus on present. So again, again, that assumes kind of like, an analytical reasoning process where you catch yourself and your thoughts and then, warn yourself to, focus on the now. The biggest, I think, the most important assumption coming from Heinrich's analysis is individualism, and that seems to be assumed in psychotherapy chatbot technology as well. So again, I'm going back to kind of my former question about like, is this even right to be called therapy? It's very individualistic technology, and it's an agent. One of the kind of people, if you talk to psychotherapists or psychiatrists or clinicians, one of the things that they are going to say is, well, look, the patient cannot really arrive or catch their kind of reasoning and how they're thinking about phenomena without the help of another person. So there's actually very important philosophical work on this about how self-knowledge is almost impossible. We can be, delusional. We can be lying to ourselves without realizing that we are doing. And in fact, one of the philosophers, David Joplin, talks about how self-knowledge is dialogical in the sense that we need another person to kind of converse with, exchange ideas with, and be challenged by to actually understand our true mental states. So we should not be underestimating the therapist's ability, therefore, to challenge the patients and encourage them to notice the connection between their moods and behavior in the cognitive behavior therapy setting. But that's not what the chatbot is doing. Chatbot is learning from you as much as you are willing and able to share with them. So if you are blind to your own mental states and your own kind of states of mind, how can you actually share that with the chatbot, and then they will, help you in return? So that's the huge problem. And again, it's the kind of implication of it, or the result of an individualistic assumption of this chatbot. Another important thing that a lot of psychotherapists and philosophers of psychiatry and ethicists actually talk about is the importance of therapist's character in the therapeutic context. So Jennifer Radin and Jerry Knoll has this fantastic article, I think is now published online, where they talk about how there are distinctive demands on the therapist's character, but those demands increase even more so if these therapists are working with immigrant populations. Immigrant and refugee populations. And they analyze a number of case vignettes in the context of the United States, but we can easily apply them to the kind of refugee mental health treatment context. So these were up to now some of the assumptions that weird people had made about human psychology that were put forward by Heinrich. And I'm going to add a few more to these assumptions, what I call weird assumptions of psychotherapy chatbot technology. Another assumption is made that is that these chatbots are extremely culturally insular. They are very Western. So they are actually neglecting the entire scholarship in anthropology and philosophy and psychiatry and psychotherapy about the value of culturally sensitive psychiatry and cultural competence in the clinic. If you're a social worker receiving training, one of the things that you learn is the importance of understanding the culture, the background of the person that you're dealing with. And this is further highlighted if that person is coming from a different culture to yours. So in this sense, for instance, talking or wanting to talk about your problems seems to be assumed to be universal traits by this psychotherapy chatbot technology, but they're not. As someone, again, from Turkey, I spent some time in Eastern Turkey. I have really hard time picturing some of the men, older men, wanting to talk about their feelings. I mean, it's rather important to keep your problems to yourself. You always have to present this like tough kind of presence that you cannot be really shaken. So it can be really, really hard for these people to share. And in fact, they might feel worse if they share how hard of a time that they're having. So, and kind of giving them these apps is like this kind of almost this deaf, like the culturally deaf place to be, assuming that they would actually want to do this. And again, talking about your problems may not be socially acceptable in that parts of the world. And there's a great example, actually, I want to give, coming again from Radin and Knoll's article. They talk about different kind of boundaries or different assumptions or desires about individuality. They talk about how, you know, being appreciated to be an independent individual is primarily a Western phenomenon. Again, so Noel is a therapist, and he had an encounter with a 19-year-old Somali woman who was having kind of a schizoid episode. And when he wanted to talk to her in the room, he asked her mother to leave the room. And the mother was extremely offended by this, because in Somali culture, I mean, your family is everything. You're not, as an adolescent, you're not really expected or motivated to be, you know, an individual in your own right, but rather your ties lies in your family. So they talk about, like, even the importance of understanding different expectations from patients and their families, or from adolescents, can be a very, very important nuance. And of course, when we are thinking about a chatbot, I mean, chatbot does not have the sophistication and complication to kind of consider all of these things, and it's not really, you know, designed to do that. And the other kind of problematic assumption here, as I said, like, there's a lot of emphasis on the limitation of the number of people or therapists who speak Arabic to actually support refugees, and that, you know, this Arabic-speaking chatbot seems to kind of do the work. But there is, I think, a mistaken assumption that language equals to communication. A lot of psychotherapy is about what you say, of course, but also how you say it, or how you stay silent, how you show and convey warmth and support, so that the individual who is coming to get help from you actually opens up and shares the problems that are bothering them, right? So language does not equal, like, them, the chatbot understanding or speaking Arabic does not make it a good, excellent communicator in the context of therapy. So something like listening attentively, how do we even actually judge that a chatbot might be listening to us you know, attentively? So again, this cannot be replaced. You know, this cannot replace actual therapists, actual people who are providing care. And also, it's wrong to assume that language, just knowing the language, will convey all the unspoken and important parts of the therapeutic concepts. So one might say, okay, so great, like, now you're laying out the scholarship in front of us about self-knowledge and how psychotherapy works and so on and so forth. But the truth is, people are in refugee camps, and they are struggling with a lot of mental health issues. And, like, why don't we give this a try? Like, you know, who cares, like, that there are all these, like, issues that if it's helping. I mean, I think we should stop there, because I don't think it, you know, it may not be reasonable to expect that it's working, given those problems, and especially kind of the diversity of different cultures in experiencing mental health issues and expressing their mental health problems, right? And also, there's a recent meta study that looked at kind of the use of variety of psychotherapy-related health apps and their effectiveness, and the results are not conclusive. So, you know, anecdotally, we can say, well, it seems to help. There's an actually Oxford study that just came out, I think, last year. They worked with adolescents, and they used this app among the adolescent population. And one of the ideas was, because, you know, younger people are more, you know, savvy with the technology. In fact, it's more comfortable for them just to text to seek help, as opposed to talk to someone or seek a therapist and so on. But again, that's a very uniquely Western context. And again, even those findings were not conclusive. So one might say, okay, so you seem to be suggesting, let's not send chatbots there, but let's send actual people who will be able to support and help. But isn't that also somewhat medicalizing these social problems, right? Like, you know, even the fact that a, you know, a refugee will receive mental health care seems a little, well, maybe like that's also medicalizing social problems. I think, I mean, there is definitely kind of truth to this, but I think it's an important thing to realize, you know, going back to kind of humanism, right? Like if there's a refugee in a camp who is struggling with mental health issues, do you really want to send them a chatbot? I think that can be framed as intrinsically dehumanizing, and like other methods, when, you know, being present, a therapist listening to you actively, or you know, someone, a healthcare professional listening to you actively, showing care, might be framed as like more humanistic. Doctors, therapists, other medical professionals who are all actually humans might be there to actually bear witness to individuals suffering and listening to their stories and offering help. And again, you know, just to kind of plug in this entire notion of health humanities, as a field emerged, as this interdisciplinary field emerged, so that people's health experiences can be kind of witnessed, not from a biological medical standpoint, but also from a social, psychological, and individual support standpoint. And there's an increased attention on the value of listening to and hearing people's narratives. So I think, especially in a crisis, in a humanitarian crisis like refugee crisis, I think the interventions that we want to do to help those individuals should also be very humanistic and humanitarian. And I don't think that sending them chatbots as interventions is the way to go. So what are my conclusions? These are the moments where I feel kind of helpless as a philosopher, because, you know, after all, I'm sitting and reflecting on these issues rather than practically helping. But I think there's actually a lot of work that can be accomplished by scholars in the health humanities and large. First of all, I think whenever there's a new technology that promises to do all of these things, we have to think about about financial interest and kind of follow the money. Who is benefiting from these kinds of chatbots? Who actually makes money, makes profit from them? And that's kind of one way to look at this. So when my students ask me, like, then what do we do? I'm like, well, ask yourself question, like, is this really going to be serving the interest that is designated, that purportedly will serve, or is it serving some other interest? So the other kind of, you know, final word is, you know, just kind of understanding that, you know, these like weird characteristics are not universal human traits. And I think we need more cross-cultural research coming from, you know, all around the world to kind of enlighten, to help us think about the complexity of human psychology. And that's going to be very, very important. And I also see another opportunity for health humanities fields in general, that we can learn a lot from care practices of different cultures by kind of sharing some of this work in platforms like this. And finally, I want to kind of, you know, in the context of health humanities, plug this book that is almost published. I think some of the chapters are already published online, but we put together this book on psychotherapy ethics. And one of the most exciting parts of this book is it's looking at psychotherapy from the perspective of a variety of backgrounds, and even the collaborators, we're all, you know, from different parts of the world. And it actually created very interesting conversations about different psychotherapeutic practices in different societies. It's very different in the United States, for instance, than it is in Switzerland. You know, largely due to due to differences in the healthcare system, but also we have a lot of articles that talks about you know, non-Western cultures and non-Western standards for psychotherapeutic ethics and so on and so forth. So I really hope that, you know, you will have a time to take a look at that. And on that note, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Serife. That was a really interesting talk. I learned a lot about many things, especially about chatbots. This is a whole new world to me, and I guess it is a whole new world to many people here in the audience. So I look forward to hearing from all of you if you have questions. So maybe remind you for people who came in late that if you have a question, just let me know first as a host, and I'll kind of point towards people who are about to ask their question. So I had a question first from Andreas. Andreas, would you care to switch on your microphone and ask your question?
You were supposed to read it out loud, but I'm willing to, to ask the question myself.
It's so blurry, I wouldn't dare to. So you.
Serife, thank you very much. It was a really great talk. I have a question regarding what you said about the non-weird refugees, and you mentioned that they often would like to talk about personal problems because they're not as self-obsessed as weird people are, and so there are cultural factors that discourage in general to talk about personal problems, and they're reluctant themselves to talk about those problems because they're shaped by the culture, of course. Now, within weird populations, there are subpopulations as well, and I think that, well, especially in the paper that you mentioned first, that's in the book, but in the paper, Henrik acknowledges that there are different differences within nations. And for instance, in Belgium, there are urban groups and people that live more in suburban or rural areas, and even within Belgium, there are groups that seem to disencourage to talk about personal problems, and members of those groups that are reluctant to speak about those about their problems. Now, usually this is how people react to that. Well, very often it is mentioned that the suicide rates there are way higher than among those groups that are willing to talk about this, and that there is apparently a taboo on talking about your own problems, and that we should do something about that taboo, and that we should actually encourage them, almost force them to talk about it, and that the problem is the culture, and that we should address that culture. Now, I guess you're not, well, one of the takeaway messages of your talk is, well, that would be a really weird thing to do, address the culture and try to change those people. Now, do you think that that reluctance to address cultural issues as problematic in dealing with psychotherapy, and the willingness to undergo psychotherapy with or without chatbots, whether we should have the same reluctance with regard to cultural differences but within a population?
Oh yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there were some parts of your question where I didn't quite hear you as well, but I think I understood your main question, so I'm going to answer it, but if I didn't, so you can kind of repeat. So yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to like not assume any homogeneity in like either the weird cultures or, you know, non-Western cultures. You know, I was talking about that earlier, just before the talk. I'm from Turkey, and, you know, Istanbul may look very different from, you know, a small town in Eastern Turkey, in a village, right? Like there's no homogeneity. Like there are some people, I mean, some parts of Istanbul is very weird, but then some other parts are not, definitely not weird. So I think it's important not to assume homogeneity. And I think the other issue is maybe like class is another thing. Like even, you know, we should not assume all United States, for instance, is weird. The socioeconomic status, you know, the kind of cultural heritage and so on and so factors, that there are all these like little hubs of cultures. So I think, so one of the things is like in general, I mean, this is something coming from, I think, a Freudian framework of like kind of this idea of talking out your problem, kind of reframing or dealing with your emotions and so on. And historically speaking, one of, you know, psychodynamic therapy between the therapist and the patient became really popular in the United States at the kind of in the wake of the Vietnam War. A lot of people were coming from war and who are kind of thought of as like these like tough soldiers who fought the enemy and like so on, and they're coming back with a lot of psychological problems and issues. And in those times, having a therapist, having someone to kind of speak up and maybe relive some of those experiences and so on, actually served as a big kind of outdoor, an opening thing. And I don't think, I don't know, I don't want to say whether we can universalize that or not, but when I think about some of my own experiences, in Eastern Turkey, there is like maybe not like a therapist, but people socialize a lot, right? You can go to these like tea houses in the afternoon and play games with your friends and drink tea. That conversation, like muhabbet, like
Seems like we lost Serife, or am I the only one not to hear?
No, she's gone.
Let's see if we can do something about that. Just a minute, ladies and gentlemen, while I'm trying to get Serife back on board. She'll respond to a message. I'm very sorry about this. We'll try and get her back. But I don't
Hold you personally responsible.
I really don't know. Probably there's another hailstorm going over Texas right now. And then we can. This looks like. It takes 30 seconds. Well, yes. Okay. Thank you, Anna. Looks like one of those internet fails where it kicks the person out of Zoom and then reconnects. Well, let's hope that's indeed the case. The thing is, I can't find her on the chat even, so I think she's really lost to us. So let's see if I can email her and kindly ask her to come back. So we have people waiting. Ah, there she is again. Okay, I think she's back, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, Serife. We lost you temporarily, luckily. Are you there?
I'm sorry. I got kicked out and then now I'm back. Sorry about that.
Did your cat do this, or was it one of those hailstorms?
I had enough of being away from me.
Okay. So you were responding to Andreas's question, but I'm afraid we'll have to move on now because time is running out, and I have plenty of questions coming in.
Sure.
One from Anna. From Anna West, who's about to leave. She really wanted to ask a question. I'm sorry for those who I already promised to unable to ask question, but Anna is going to leave soon, and she'd like to ask a question first. Anna, can you come up front and switch on your microphone? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hi, Serife. Thanks for this delightful talk. It's great to see you. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about appropriate technology and whether that has come into the conversation, widely conceived as a progressive politics in the 70s, but now usually critiqued as being an offer of second-class solutions. in ways that are sort of dumping convenient technology and sort of built into that design for development paradigm and technofuturism, but not something that we would see as adequate, perhaps in another context. And so I'm curious if any of those analytics have come up in the exploration you've been doing.
Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question, especially in the kind of context of COVID. I've been thinking a lot about, like, you know, helpful or unhelpful. I think, like, you know, distant therapies, like through, you know, camera or, you know, shared, I think they're fine. You know, they're fantastic, right? You know, and that means like actually more convenience. And again, you know, there are lots of advantages of because that involves a human interaction. I think one of my biggest, also like as a humanist, one of my biggest concern is that like this is an interaction between a person and a bot. I don't care how high the technology, AI technology is to imitate human intelligence and learning. I think it's just intrinsically dehumanizing to be responding to individuals' distress by sending them chatbots. But these kinds of technologies, I think Zoom is great, distance learning. And there's actually a lot of also, I should also say this, some kind of apps that are used as a support like framework. So the doctor has access to it. So it's a triangulation between, you know, the patient, the app, and the doctor. So part of the project is, you know, for the patient to enter their feelings and moods and state. And then when they kind of meet face to face, it's a good record keeping system that helps the individual that way. So that's a great kind of aid, a supplementary technology, not a replacement of actually human caregivers. So I'm very sympathetic to that. Thank you for your question.
Thank you, Anna, for that question. Astrid, you're next. Astrid van den Ede. Yeah.
Yes, so I studied philosophy of psychiatry, and I afterwards worked with refugees in Belgium, and I was basically stricken by the fact that this technology would even be proposed as helpful, because in so many ways it's just so wrong. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts about, well, in one way, it seems that it's an excuse to not provide any structural mental health care, either to refugees in a new country of residence or in camps. Seems like a very easy opting out. And then, in a way, it's weird that this gets proposed. Well, I know that if you talk to one person in the field and say, hey, would this be a good solution? They would all go screaming, no.
Yes, yes.
How do people imagine that this is helpful? I'm sorry, I'm just completely baffled.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, I feel the same way. I actually have not talked to a single expert who was like, oh, this is a great idea. And that's what kind of baffles me about this enthusiasm. And, you know, like, and these are not kind of, these are very important researchers who have studied mental health for, you know, during their entire careers. And they think that they have like this so much enthusiasm about technology. In my experience, I read a lot of history of psychiatry. There's always been a new thing that everybody was so excited about, which proved to not actually be helpful. Even the move to the medical model of mental illness was initially kind of this enthusiasm about, oh, syphilis, we now treat as syphilis, which has a lot of mental disorder symptoms with this antibiotic. Now we should be able to treat all other mental illnesses with like medication, and that kind of enthusiasm almost came at the expense of studying, I don't know, cognitive psychology or psychology. There are even like wide gaps between medicine and psychiatry and like psychology. There are lots of kind of criticisms coming from psychology communities, clinical psychology communities against psychiatry. And I think financial interest seems to be the biggest driving force. I was fuming when I found out that FDA, Food Drug Administration, actually kind of lifted a lot of the restrictions on the use of these apps, kind of using COVID as an excuse to, I think, lift all of these. I really hope that it's different or is perceived different in Europe. I want to think of this as a uniquely American assumption, but thank you. I would love to talk to you more about your experience working with refugees in Belgium.
Yeah, thank you for bringing attention to this whole problem.
we'll bring you into contact then.
That'd be lovely.
It studied with us at the Institute. René, Kate has a question for you as well, Serife. René?
Yes, thank you very much for a very rich presentation. I didn't know the concept of weird and the chatbot, so I learned a lot, but still there's a question, because you say, in fact, it is based upon CBT. And I've looked at studies on CBT within the context of the Arab culture, and it is effective there, but although less effective than in the Western world. But that doesn't mean that it's non-effective. So there are so many levels in your presentation, because you also could say, well, you have to change the algorithm of the chatbot, and then it will work, as it appears to work within the Western context. If you thought about that concept, is it a wrong algorithm, or is it more that you have a sort of moral disapproval of the whole concept?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. I think CBT, I didn't know actually about like how CBT, whether it was effective in Arabic communities or not. I'm not actually against CBT at all, but I don't think this is CBT, because in the cognitive behavior therapy context, that relationship between the therapist and the patient is very important, because the therapist is there to, like, you know, help you find the kind of problems in your reasoning and thoughts. So that's a dialogical, interactive process. And I think that's as humanistic as it can go. But this very idea of chatbot being able to detect your shortcuts, I don't think that's true. I don't think that these chatbots are as flexible or as sophisticated as humans, but also this very notion of there's no person there, and you're basically almost kind of creating this alternative version of yourself to talk back to yourself, seems kind of going against the more, you know, less individualistic context that a lot of Middle Eastern communities actually share in their like regular lives. So I think CBT is great, but being able to actually give CBT is questionable. Thank you for your question.
Your microphone, Peter.
Peter, your mic is off.
Oh, sorry. Okay, my mistake. Next up is Ortwin, one of our colleagues at the Health Humanities Initiative. Ortwin?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Siri, for this very inspiring talk. I'm a scholar of literature, and I was constantly thinking about that kind of context, and was trying to think the devil's advocate's line. You know, to grant the people who do these things at least the idea that they are there to bring succor and help and comfort to people in very distressing circumstances. And was then thinking that through from the position of literary studies. As you know, there is a huge cultural industry about translation of refugee experiences, whereby some of the criticism sometimes is that these are typically weird authors who make use of the availability of refugees as pathos-laden carriers of injustice, which they then translate into their cultural commodity. I'm putting it deliberately crudely, but I was just wondering whether you're thinking of locating your research in that broader question of how do you deal with the translation, the necessity to somehow translate the experience of those people whose suffering very often is a consequence of the cultural imperialism that you're perpetuating when you're doing that?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. I actually spend a lot of time, and this is kind of where, you know, I think my interest in feminist epistemology and feminist philosophy of science like lies in, how do we actually present someone else's testimony? Or like, how do we understand, how do we first give uptake to their experience in their context without objectifying them, right? And, you know, I think like one of the worries can be like, well, if we start kind of, you know, talking about these people's experiences from our like Western lens, we're actually kind of reading into what they are saying rather than giving them uptake. I think we have to spend a lot of time thinking about that person's context and and value system and their needs, right? So
oops. Yep. Texas connection is not doing well today.
Berbeskeder.
Next time we'll do it through satellite connection. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, let's see. But I think we still have Serife here. This is weird. No, now we
No, she's gone.
Now she's gone. So let's hope she returns quickly. We have 2 more questions. I hope we can still ask them to Serife before the end of the session, which is in more or less 5 minutes. Let's see if she shows up again. And it's really a pity because there's so many interesting questions coming up. I know this because they come through me. Okay. Let's see. It takes a while apparently for her to realize that she's not in the session anymore. In all her enthusiasm, she's probably talking and going on.
While we're waiting, maybe I'll give a tip. There's this series now on Netflix, which is called Ethos on Netflix, but it's called Berbeskeder in the original Turkish. And it's about the conflict between Islamic communities and Freudian, Jungian psychotherapy. I'm not sure whether it's good. It's very enjoyable, but it's exactly about this, the clash between a traditional Turkish community mentality and an individualistic Freudian, Jungian psychotherapeutical approach.
Okay, and this is called Ethos.
Ethos in the Netflix version, but Berbeskeder in Turkish.
Yeah.
And it's something that she would be, if she's seen it, she would be able to tell me whether it's any good, or it's just stereotypical.
Yeah. Oh, it's okay. It's very interesting. Orkin, thanks for this tip. Always good to have something to look out for when we switch Netflix on. There is Serife again. Hi, Serife.
Hi, I'm sorry. Today is not a good internet day for here for some reason. So quickly respond to your question. I don't think we need to be like policing who does what. Like there was a book here published a few years ago called American Dirt that talked about the immigrants coming from the South to the United States, entering through the southern border. So it was a work of fiction, and the author got so many criticisms for writing this work because she herself was not an immigrant. I'm a little bit worried about that, because I mean, the very idea of literature is using our imagination and our understanding of the world and so on, like to kind of talk about these kinds of issues. Yet that said, I think there has to be ways in which we give uptake to people who are speaking out their narratives. So I think using a framework like, for instance, like Rita Charan talks about like using literary theory as a framework to give uptake to patients. I disagree with that. I think we really need to kind of find a way to represent what individuals are talking about their experiences, as best as we can, without any kind of imposing any kind of phenomenological or literary framework to those kinds of experiences. At least that's what I try to do in my own work. I, kind of want to reflect the complexity of that, whatever the person is uttering. I think but that definitely we need but more conversations, I think, about how to give uptake and how to represent people's testimonies.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Serife. There's plenty of comments also in the chat box. I'll try to hold on to that information, Serife, for you, so you can have a look at it afterwards.
Actually, yeah, because I lost them after.
Yeah, of course, I know. No worries. So for those who are about to leave, I mean, please do so. Don't wait. We were about to, well, it's about 5:30 over here. Serife, do you have a few more minutes to spare with us?
Yeah, absolutely. I do.
Okay, great. Then we have one more question from Jana. Jana, could you come up front and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you for this rich and illuminating talk. I'm pursuing my PhD on the topic of epistemological and ethical challenges of chatbots for mental health in Zurich.
Oh,
and I would like to ask you two questions. Firstly, could you explain more to what extent digital phenotyping plays a role in the chatbot technology? And what exactly is the role? Because from what I read, digital phenotyping was in the context of diagnosis or personalized treatment. But when I was testing, for example, Bobot, I couldn't really see that the digital phenotyping played a role, because it seems to me that it worked rather in the way of application of specific techniques that are rather limited. So I was wondering, what is the role of the digital phenotyping?
Yeah, that's a great question. And digital phenotyping, there's like the active data, digital phenotyping, and passive data. So in the chatbot technology, the idea is that it's using active data insofar as the person is reporting their mental states, entering information and interacting with that. So that's kind of how it seems, and that's how it learns from you. There's an algorithm where, I think maybe it looks for certain keywords and so on and so forth in that listening. But people like Incel and others are very excited about using passive data digital phenotyping just from the cell phone use. They think that somebody entering in maybe a schizoid episode might have certain, lessen their frequency of interactions and so on and so forth. I have a paper published in Philosophy and Technology recently on this topic. And I actually cite a couple of studies coming from somewhere in Boston, either MIT or somewhere else, that looks at some of the kind of applications of digital phenotyping on mental health context per se. But if you read Incel's article, and he also has a review in the Atlantic magazine interview, he is like, this is it. And he has his own company right now trying to do that. The other interesting development is I was reached out by this Silicon Valley startup company, and they are trying to develop diagnostic techniques of mental disorders as something like things like Alzheimer's by typing speed. That's very interesting to me. And that's more different, I think, from entering your own mental states for therapy and stuff. They're measuring your typing speed to see if, you might be developing Alzheimer's, which also, I'm curious to follow their work, and they haven't published any studies or anything yet, but I'm curious to see what happens there.
Thank you. I have one more question.
Yes.
What would be your thoughts on the possibility that users and patients might build a relationship with chatbots? I mean, philosophically or ontologically, we can deny the agency, but from the experience, the users can perceive chatbots as agents. As you mentioned, the Bobot has a good sense of humor. He tries also to show some empathy, and I think that it's very problematic, ethically speaking.
No, that's a great question. I don't know if you follow, maybe a month ago or so, there's now a new technology. I think the Microsoft got the patent for it, or was it Apple? Anyway, one of those big companies got the patent for it to bring to life your loved one, who died. So basically, by using their information, the digital footprints, they kind of recreate their agency, and you can use them. And they got the patent for it. There's apparently no plans to actually develop the technology, but I'm like, then why did you get the patent? I find it very problematic, and especially I think for the younger generation who have been born into, a digital life and digital world, and there might be a lot of problems emerging from that if they actually think that it's a person. I mean, I think it's really ironic that they had to call the chatbot therapist a friend as opposed to a therapist to be able to speak to the Syrian refugees in the camp. That's that's also disturbing. And again, the other issue is if you're developing a medicine, it goes through so many IRB reviews. Ethical criteria is more or less explicit now, at least, but there's no kind of guidance or ethical frameworks for these technologies, and technology is developing so fast. And I think it's a really good opportunity for health humanities scholars to jump on board and start talking about the potential dangers and maybe trying to develop some kind of criteria into the ethics of actually using and developing these technologies.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I love your glasses.
Thank you.
Yeah, I do too, actually. I was thinking like, what is, okay, now I see this. Okay. Something in my brain said there's something wrong. Okay, sorry. Nidesh Latu, you had a question. Would you like to come to the microphone?
Yes, thanks very much, Serife, I think, for a very important critique. I fully agree with you that this technology seems indeed very far removed with different layers to the experience of trauma that is characteristic of refugee camps. And I'm not a specialist of that, but I had a question. Since you mentioned weird people and anthropology, it seems indeed that an anthropological distance is necessary in order to perceive our assumptions and in order to encounter another culture. And I was wondering if the tradition of ethnopsychiatry plays a role in your account. I know it's important in France via figures like Georges Devreux and Toby Nathan, who come out of psychoanalysis. And that's the second part of the question. The experience of a refugee camp is a collective experience, not an individual experience. And it seems that the collectivity, or at least that the trauma that is addressed would benefit from a collective form of therapy that is embodied and shared within the community. So I was wondering on these two aspects, ethnopsychiatry and the communal side of the therapy.
That's a great question. And so I'm not familiar with the ethnopsychiatrist that you cited, but during graduate school, one of my favorite people to read was Arthur Kleinman, who's a cultural anthropologist, and he wrote a lot on cross-cultural psychiatry and so on. And I was really kind of shocked once again, or maybe not shocked, that none of that literature, that important body of work is seen to be taken kind of into consideration here. And I think that has a lot to do with now how psychiatry education happens in the United States. Fewer and fewer medical students take courses like anthropology or even psychology in their training. And unfortunately, things like Freudian psychoanalysis or importance of different cultural differences in psychiatry, all of that seems to be dying off. Like a lot of my students in the medical humanities program don't know Freud or psychoanalysis. I mean, I'm not saying that, or they're not aware of some people like Arthur Kleinman. I mean, I try to teach them in the context of our medical humanities major. But I think that like one of the big problems in the United States is that kind of neglecting that work. This is my first kind of public presentation of this topic in its application to refugees and in relation to weird people. And I'm looking forward to actually diving more into ethnopsychiatry to talk about some of these issues and raising the concerns. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Serife, and thank you all for your interesting question, people in the audience. I think we have to wrap it up here. I'm sorry for those who haven't been able to ask their questions. I'm sorry again, Zeynep, for overlooking yours, which was very similar to the question just asked by Nidesh.
Yeah, no, collectivity is super important. Yes, yeah. That's a great question.
It is a bit hard sometimes to keep track of all the questions and comments and to see who they're addressed to.
There was also a question I saw earlier about like privacy related issues. Again, in the kind of paper that I published in Philosophy and Technology, I talked about, data privacy and all of those kinds of concerns in that paper as well. But you know, they're like this talk these questions have been super helpful. It just is kind of showing me how broad and, you know, important questions are. And if people have questions or comments, my email address must be on the website, or you can just go to my website and feel free to send me emails, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, that's great, Serife. There's one question I wanted to ask you still, if indeed I could pass on your email address. Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. I might be a little slow getting back. Just this is a busy time of the semester for me, but I will get back. I'm good at responding to emails. It might be a bit late. So another thing you're good at, apart from giving talks on interesting topics. Thank you. Thank you so much, Serife, and thanks to all of you for being here, being so you know, attentive and asking. Yeah. Yes. Have a good evening, everyone. And Serife, maybe you could stay just a minute. We could talk a little bit more. Sure. So bye now for.
Bye everyone. Thank you, Peter, for organizing this. Thank you, Serife, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch. Bye.
Bye.